The telegram sat unopened on Hermann Göring's desk for nearly an hour. His adjutant had marked it urgent, but Göring had learned to distrust urgency. Most intelligence reports were exaggerations. Most production estimates were inflated by Allied propaganda designed to demoralize the Reich. He had built his career on confidence, on the unshakable belief that German engineering and industrial discipline were unmatched. But when he finally broke the seal and read the figures, his hand stopped moving. The numbers claimed that American aircraft production had exceeded 100,000 units in a single year. March 1944, Hall, Germany. Göring read the report twice, then a third time. He cross-referenced it against previous intelligence summaries, looking for an arithmetic error or a misplaced decimal point. There was none. The estimate had been corroborated by multiple sources. Reconnaissance photographs, intercepted shipping manifests, prisoner interrogations. The conclusion was unavoidable. The United States was producing aircraft at a rate that exceeded the combined output of Germany, Britain, Italy, and Japan, not by a narrow margin, by an order of magnitude. He set the telegram down and stared at the wall. Somewhere in his mind, a calculation was trying to complete itself. A calculation about time, attrition, and inevitability. But the numbers were too large. They refused to fit into any framework he understood. For the first time in the war, Göring felt the ground shift beneath him. When Germany launched its conquest of Europe, its industrial superiority seemed absolute. The Reich had spent years preparing for total war. Factories had been militarized, raw materials stockpiled, labor forces organized under centralized command. The industrial machine that supported the Wehrmacht was efficient, disciplined, and purpose-built for sustained conflict. German aircraft production in the late 1930s had outpaced Britain and France combined. The Luftwaffe entered the war with the most advanced air force in the world. Its bombers had shattered Warsaw and Rotterdam. Its fighters had dominated the skies over Poland, Norway, and France. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 was faster and more maneuverable than anything the Allies could field. The Junkers Ju-87 Stuka had become a symbol of German air power, its distinctive siren a psychological weapon as effective as its bombs. Göring had every reason to believe that air superiority would remain a German advantage throughout the war. The United States, by contrast, appeared industrially formidable but strategically irrelevant. Its factories were designed for consumer goods, not military production. Its workforce was decentralized and inexperienced in wartime manufacturing. Its aircraft designs were outdated. The American military had spent decades underfunded and under-equipped, constrained by isolationist politics and economic depression. When Pearl Harbor brought the United States into the war, German strategists predicted a slow, chaotic mobilization. They expected bottlenecks. They expected the kind of inefficiency that plagued democracies. They expected America to struggle for years before it could contribute meaningfully to the Allied war effort. What they did not expect was for American industry to become the most powerful force in the war within 18 months. The first signs were subtle. Intelligence reports in early 1942 noted an uptick in American aircraft production, but the numbers were still modest. A few thousand planes per month. Respectable but not threatening. German factories were producing comparable figures. The gap, if it existed, seemed manageable. But by mid-1942, the reports began to shift. American production was accelerating faster than German analysts had predicted. The numbers were no longer modest. They were doubling every few months. New factories were opening at a pace that seemed logistically impossible. Existing plants were expanding beyond their original capacity. Göring ordered a review of the intelligence. He wanted verification. He wanted to know if the figures were inflated by propaganda or counting methods that included non-combat aircraft. The review confirmed the numbers. If anything, Earlier estimates had been conservative. American aircraft production was not just growing, it was exploding. The confusion deepened when German intelligence officers began analyzing how the Americans were achieving these production rates. Traditional industrial theory suggested that rapid expansion would compromise quality. Rushed training would lead to defects. Hastily built factories would suffer from inefficiency. Mass production of complex machinery required time, expertise, and infrastructure. The Americans were bypassing all of those constraints. Reconnaissance photographs showed factories that had not existed a year earlier. Massive facilities sprawling across hundreds of acres, built in a matter of months. Assembly lines longer than any in Europe. Workforce populations that rivaled small cities. The scale was incomprehensible. German factories relied on skilled craftsmen who had spent years mastering their trade. American factories were training workers in weeks and putting them on production lines that churned out bombers faster than German plants could produce fighters. It should not have worked. Every principle of industrial engineering suggested it would fail, but the aircraft kept arriving. And they were not failing. German pilots reported that American bombers were structurally sound, mechanically reliable, and combat effective. Their engines performed well under stress. Their airframes withstood damage that would cripple European designs. Their defensive armament was formidable. These were not rushed, inferior products. They were high-quality machines built at mass production speeds. The contradiction gnawed at German strategists. How could a workforce with minimal training produce aircraft of such quality? How could factories built in months outperform plants that had been operating for decades? The answer was beginning to emerge, but it was too disruptive to accept. By late 1942, the scale of American production had become undeniable. The United States was producing more than 47,000 aircraft per year. Germany, by comparison, was producing 15,000. The gap was widening every month. Göring convened his senior staff to discuss the implications. The consensus was that the numbers, while concerning, were unsustainable. American industry was overextending. The production surge would plateau, quality would decline, logistical breakdowns would slow output. None of those predictions materialized. In 1943, American production climbed to 85,000 aircraft. The factories were not slowing down. They were accelerating. New models were entering production while older designs were still being refined. The B-17 Flying Fortress, the B-24 Liberator, the P-51 Mustang, each one rolling off assembly lines at rates that seemed impossible. German intelligence began to investigate the organizational structure behind this production. What they found was more troubling than the numbers themselves. The Americans had not simply scaled up existing factories. They had reimagined the entire process. Assembly lines were modularized, allowing different plants to produce components that could be integrated anywhere. Training programs were standardized, enabling rapid workforce expansion without sacrificing quality. Supply chains were coordinated across thousands of miles, synchronized to deliver materials precisely when needed. It was not chaos. It was a system more sophisticated than anything Germany had built, and it was accelerating. The symbolic element that haunted German war planners was the Willow Run plant. Built by Ford Motor Company outside Detroit, it became a case study in industrial impossibility. The facility was a single building, over a mile long, designed to mass-produce B-24 Liberators using automotive assembly line techniques. When construction began in 1941, German analysts dismissed it as propaganda. Aircraft were too complex to build like automobiles. The project would fail. Willow Run struggled initially. Early production rates were slow. Defects were common. Critics called it a failure. But by mid-1943, the plant had resolved its problems. It was producing one B-24 every 63 minutes, not per day, per hour. a 4-engine heavy bomber, fully assembled, every 63 minutes. German intelligence officers who reviewed the report assumed it was a typographical error. No factory in the world could sustain that pace, but confirmation arrived from multiple sources. Willow Run was not an outlier, it was a model. Other factories were adopting similar methods. Production rates across the American aviation industry were climbing to levels that defied every historical precedent. Göring demanded an explanation. His staff had none. The industrial advantage Germany had relied on was evaporating. Worse, it was inverting. The Americans were not just catching up. They were lapping Germany in a race that had seemed unlosable. And the realization that followed was more destabilizing than the production figures themselves. The problem was not temporary. It was structural. Germany had built its war economy around the assumption that industrial output was limited by skilled labor, precision engineering, and time. The Americans had shattered that assumption. They had proven that mass production, properly organized, could achieve both speed and quality. They had demonstrated that a workforce could be trained rapidly if the system was designed for rapid training. They had shown that industrial capacity was not fixed. It was scalable. Germany had optimized for a European war, a war of limited duration, fought with existing resources, won by tactical superiority and operational discipline. The Americans had built for a global war, a war of attrition sustained by industrial output, won by overwhelming material advantage. The strategies were incompatible, and only one of them could function at the scale the war had reached. By 1944, the disparity had become catastrophic. American production exceeded 96,000 aircraft that year. Germany produced less than 40,000. But the numbers alone did not capture the full extent of the imbalance. American aircraft were being delivered to multiple theaters simultaneously. Europe, the Pacific, North Africa, the Mediterranean. Training units in the United States, Lend-Lease shipments to the Soviet Union and Britain. German production, by contrast, was barely sufficient to replace losses on a single front. The Luftwaffe was shrinking. Pilot losses were irreplaceable. Fuel shortages grounded squadrons. Aircraft sat unused because spare parts were unavailable. The industrial base that had once seemed invincible was collapsing under sustained pressure. And that pressure was maintained by an industrial system that Göring had never believed possible. The truth was simple, but it took years to fully comprehend. Wars are not won by the best technology or the most disciplined soldiers. They are won by logistics, resources, and industrial capacity. The side that can produce more, faster, and longer will eventually overwhelm any tactical or operational advantage its opponent possesses. Germany had mastered the tactics of war. The Americans had mastered the system. The failure was not one of effort or competence. German engineers were among the best in the world. German factories operated with remarkable efficiency given the constraints they faced. German planners worked tirelessly to maximize output, but the system itself was limited. It was designed for a different kind of war, a shorter war, a European war. The Americans had built for the war they were actually fighting. A global, industrial, attritional conflict that would last years and consume resources at scales previously unimaginable. They had recognized early that victory required not just good aircraft, but an inexhaustible supply of them. Not just skilled pilots, but a training pipeline that could replace losses indefinitely. Not just tactical excellence, but systemic superiority. Germany could not adapt. The infrastructure was already built. The workforce was already allocated. The strategic assumptions were embedded too deeply into doctrine and planning. Shifting to a different model would have required time Germany did not have and resources it could not spare. The gap was unbridgeable, and by 1944, everyone knew it. The air war over Europe was effectively decided not by dogfights or bombing raids, but by production lines in Michigan, California, and Washington. The skies over Germany filled with Allied aircraft not because American pilots were superior, but because American factories could replace every loss within days. German pilots, no matter how skilled, were fighting an unwinnable war of attrition. Göring had built the Luftwaffe into the most feared air force in the world, but he had never anticipated that industrial capacity could become the decisive factor in air warfare. He had assumed that quality would trump quantity. That tactical brilliance would overcome material disadvantage. That German discipline would outlast American excess. He was wrong on every count. The story of World War II is often told through battles, generals, and tactical decisions, but beneath those narratives is a simpler truth. The war was won in factories. It was won by engineers who redesigned production processes, by workers who learned new skills in weeks, by planners who coordinated supply chains across oceans, by a system that understood scale as a weapon. Hermann Göring never expected America's aircraft factories to outproduce all of Europe combined, but they did. And in doing so, they proved that industrial power, properly mobilized, is the ultimate strategic advantage. The lesson remains relevant. In any prolonged conflict, the side that can sustain production will outlast the side that cannot. No amount of tactical genius can compensate for systemic industrial inferiority. The war was not lost in the skies over Berlin. It was lost in the factories that could not match the output of Willow Run. That is not a comforting conclusion, but it is an accurate one. If industrial capacity remains the ultimate determinant of modern conflict, what does that mean for nations today that have outsourced their manufacturing base? Is tactical superiority still achievable when production itself has become the battlefield? This video is based on historical records, expert analysis, and documented sources. Some interpretations are simplified for storytelling clarity.